Kia ora koutou. This is an unusual experience for me. I have turned on the recording. Yeah. It's an unusual experience for me because I'm normally talking to groups of Anglicans and I never had anyone in the front pew. And even some Baptists, clearly. Thank you. Thank you, Nicola, for inviting me along to this fascinating topic. There's a passage from an early fantasy work that I've heard quoted recently both by an eminent scientist and by an eminent poet. The passage comes from the end of the story, or towards the end of the story, when Theseus, who's that hero of Greek mythology, has been regaled by his friends with tales of magic and mayhem and mystery. And Theseus, of course, holds himself as a man of reason, and so dismisses these bizarre tales, even though his friends, put as proof of the magic the changes in their lives. But anything to do with magic or fantasy or poetry or imagination are dismissed by Theseus. Now, the irony in which we are told this is delicious and multi-leveled. For starters, Theseus trying to dismiss imagination or myth is a bit takes a little bit of accepting, rather as if Bilbo Baggins was heard dismissing or being sceptical of the existence of hobbits. But there's more. The author has Theseus dismiss poetry in lines of beautiful iambic pentameter. And then, as he is dismissing all things poetic or imaginative, he actually does it in such a way that it becomes one of the clearest celebrations of imagination's power in English literature. So here's what he says. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So, you know what I'm talking about, what this early fantasy work was? Some of you will, obviously. Midsummer Night's Dream, so it's Shakespeare. And within the world of that play, poetry, magic, and imagination run riot. And the rational and cool and self-confident Theseus turns out to be completely clueless. So when Theseus claims that things unknown are the same as airy nothing, we know not to believe him. And if we're here today as scientists or theologians or fantasy writers, we should have known that already. Because science, theology, and fantasy are all fascinated with things unknown, and all seek to gather those things unknown and give them a body, give them an expression which can be grasped by the human mind, give them comprehensible shape, give to what only appears to be airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And this, of course, is the work of imagination. It's a gift that is as important to scientists as to fantasy writers, and theology would be, frankly, impossible without it. How else could any of us reach into the unknown without the glimmering light of imagination, casting flickering shadows on these things which we otherwise couldn't see? And once having glimpsed what is there, glimpsed this truth, we continue to use imagination to give this truth. Make it accessible. Give it a name and see if the name fits. Give it habitation and see if it's fit for purpose. And then we test it. We think, what if we set up this situation or these conditions? What would happen then? Or how about from this angle? Now, perhaps the most straightforward way this is done within the broad scope of fantasy writing is when sci-fi and dystopic novels take possible ethical dilemmas that could accompany future scientific discoveries or achievements, ones that are currently unknown in the sense that we haven't quite got there yet, but are imaginatively feasible. Has anyone read any of Neil Shusterman's series? No? Okay. Well, I recommend them. He has a couple of excellent series, and both of them pose some what-ifs. What if we create a world in which we are able to transplant almost every part, 99% of a human body, successfully into another? And what if the demand for such cures grows exponentially? Where will the body parts come from? Would it make sense to unwind people who are problematic to society and distribute their parts usefully among upstanding citizens? After all, each bit of them remains alive, just spread out around other people, so you haven't actually killed them. That's the situation that his Unwound series explores. Or how about trying out a world in which artificial intelligence has enabled us to cure all ills and even reverse death? How within that world could we stop the unrelenting growth of the human population? Because if nature has stopped killing us off, does that mean we would have to start doing it ourselves? And that's a what-if that his second series, called the Scythe series, explores, where they have to allocate a group of people whose job is to systematically and coolly and unemotionally glean members of the population. Now, apart from the obvious dangers of giving humans that sort of permission, which is what, of course, the whole series is based around, he does take the opportunity to delve deeper. In one of the fascinating scenes in the first book, a wise older scythe who's training up a couple of teenagers into the role starts off by taking them to an art gallery which has got art from the old world in it, the world before AI took over. And the teens are completely bewildered by what they see in this art gallery, because it's depicting emotions that they have never experienced, passions that have a depth that they've never encountered, because deep suffering was actually unknown to them. And as a result, deep joy was equally unknown. In a world where you don't need to fear illness or accident or getting old, and death is rare rather than universal, is there any cause to fight for? Is there any meaning to find? Is there such a thing as hope, or relief, or anxiety, or happiness, or celebration? So here's a what-if played out in lives that become important to the reader. All of us will have agonized at some point in our lives over why there's so much physical suffering in the world. But how often do we agonize over what would happen if all forms of physical suffering were removed? What if science got us to the point that death could be reversed? Now, this story is not saying that we should immediately stop trying to cure all the ills of the world at all. It doesn't come down on any conclusion. Stories are much more complex and flexible than that. But it's tossing out this thought experiment as to what we might lose as well as gain if we did reach that highest of material hopes for our world. So, there are rich opportunities for ethical what-ifs in this sort of writing. But having started with this actually isn't where my main interest lies. My biggest interest is in how fantasy throws open wide open spaces to explore some very bizarre theological truths. We need big spaces for this, and that's the first of three gifts that I think fantasy writing can give us. Now, we'd almost all, even if we've read no other fantasy books, would be reasonably familiar with C.S. Lewis's Narnia books. Maybe not all of you, but a lot would. And he created a big space with these Narnia books. I know people sometimes say that they're allegories. They're actually a lot more interesting than that. Within the expanded horizons of this world, where deep magic can happen and animals can speak, all sorts of things unknown are given a local habitation and a name so that we can look at them and sometimes even feel them more clearly. Lewis set up new worlds with new norms and new histories. And then he asked, how might the Christian God respond in this world? In Magician's Nephew, we see a brand new, fresh, innocent world created. And is it possible that such a world could stay innocent? What if a being from a fallen world was to enter in? What might God, the God that Christians know through Christ, do in such worlds to counteract the effect of evil? And that's really the question that drives all 7 books in that series. And here's the key. Might the explorations of this question in another setting, another world, help us return to the same question in our own world and see it more clearly? So I think that's the first basic gift that fantasy writing gives us, this big open space to explore in. The second is how it can, in a unique way, wake us up to wonder. This is something Tolkien thought was vital, and I think one of the things that drove his writing. He called the process recovery and said it was essential. Recovery is a regaining of a clear view. We need to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be free from the drab blur of triteness, of familiarity. C.S. Lewis again, in an essay this time, wondered if people would think he was weaving a kind of spell with the beauty of the words and images he uses when he's describing the longing of God in us all. But he argues, spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness, which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. How do we see the same familiar, sometimes tired questions with fresh eyes? How do we wake up to things that are obvious? If we enter a fantasy world and are taken aback by the wonder of the fact that the grass is blue, can that help us come back to our world and think, how phenomenal that our grass is green? And it really is green out here, you must have had so much rain. The Eastern Orthodox talk about us living in a sacramental universe, that everything is filled with the energies of God. And if we could only open the door on the surface, we would see light and mystery within. Fantasy can take what we've begun to take for granted and peel back the veneer of the ordinary to reveal the mystery within. And it's that mystery which is at the heart of God. I must just tell you, I found it's a really interesting thing about the kind of AI within my computer, that when I put this picture up on the PowerPoint, you know how it often gives you a suggested label? Okay. This one was man with a hoop kneeling next to a pond. I thought, okay, artificial intelligence, but not artificial imagination. Something got missed somewhere. Okay, so the wide open spaces, the waking up to wonder. And then I think the third joy and gift of fantasy works for the theologian, we're kind of moving through the kind of old men of fantasy. This is G.K. Chesterton. Can you all see it? Can I see you read it? Oh, you want me to read it out loud because it's being recorded? I beg your pardon. Okay, the baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides to him is a St. George to kill the dragon. Exactly what the fairy tale does is this. It accustoms him for a series of clear pictures to the idea that these limitless terrors had a limit, that these shapeless enemies have enemies in the nights of God, that there's something in the universe more mystical than darkness and stronger than strong fear. Now, it's a rather odd phrase in the middle there, that it accustoms him for a series of clear pictures to the idea. It's a really awkward phrasing, but hopefully you get what he's saying. We have dragons aplenty in our lives, from the first unformed fears of childhood to the all too potent fears of adult reality. What fairy tales do, Chesterton says, is accustom our mind to the idea that there is someone or something that can and will defeat those fears. What we read shapes our minds, it just does, whatever the genre is that we're reading. But in fantasy, we have space to shape our minds to the possibility of something more, something in the realm of mystery. C.S. Lewis, again, famously described how reading George MacDonald baptized his imagination, which has to be one of the most beautiful ways of putting this. Through the magical possibilities of fantasy, we can baptize our imaginations so that the images and stories we discover in our faith are familiar, right, able to be seen and felt in a way that our reason couldn't perhaps reach. So, in what's left of today, I want to think about two theological what-ifs and see what the open spaces, wonder and imagination baptizing power of some fantasy works might do for us there. I want to move with you into two created worlds where questions which are familiar to us are turned upside down and injected with magic and shaken up and swirled with colours and then returned to us afresh. One of the most pressing issues of our day is, of course, the looming climate crisis. Increasingly, we're going to need deeper scientific understandings of what goes on and what can be done, and we need action. That's all obvious. But I believe we also need as many stories as we can find, which will help us find ways of understanding our place in creation, imaginatively, emotionally, and theologically. My interest is especially in theologically. How do we understand our relationship with creation and our responsibility to creation from a theological point of view? Or does theology have anything to say to the issue of all? I think we probably all agree it does. So, I want to start by taking you to a world created by Australian author Garth Nix. And I know at least one person here has read Garth Nix. It's the world of the Old Kingdom. The people of the Old Kingdom knew their mythic history very well. They had to, because if they lost sight of that history and where they had come from, it is possible that the world could end. Before the Old Kingdom was created, everything was free magic and was inhabited only by 9 free magic creatures called the Bright Shiners. Free magic was wild, limitless, and untamed, of immense, perhaps inexhaustible power. After many millennia, one bright shiner, called Uranus, succumbed to the lure of that power and became the destroyer, sweeping through the universe, devouring burgeoning worlds wherever it went. As it approached the unformed thing which would later become the Old Kingdom, 7 of the other bright shiners who got tired of this were ready for Uranus. Together they created a charter which bound free magic within defined limits, pushing it back to allow life to exist, filtering it gently into the manageable forms of what became known as charter magic. By pouring many of their own lives into the charter's formation, they made it strong enough to bind Uranus itself and bury it deep underground. So the charter was like an invisible network that underpinned and connected all of life in the Old Kingdom while holding the power of free magic in strict control. People of the Old Kingdom were baptized, and they were baptized by having a charter mark, a magic mark, put on their forehead, and this mark connected them to each other and to their world through those countless interlocking threads of the Charter. However, free magic, of course, still existed beyond the Charter, and that meant that the temptation to power was still there. Occasionally, one of the people of the Old Kingdom would reverse a part of the proper order of creation through murder, for example. Not only could the murdered person's blood be used to bring someone from the dead back to life, but each time such a horror was performed, a crack formed in the Charter, and that allowed a little bit of free magic to seep through, and the person who'd broken it could then tap into that power for themselves. The problem was, of course, that free magic and life can't coexist. And wherever the Charter was broken and free magic seeped through, the land became contaminated, plants died, even rocks broke. And the one foolish enough to think that he was going to be, normally a he, was able to control it and use this power, found that they themselves were destroyed. So the heroines in this series are the Whoreson, and their mission is to rebuild the Charter, to cover any cracks, right imbalances, and turn reversed orders back to where they should be. It's their work that enables life to continue, not only in the Old Kingdom itself, but in countries around it which grew up after the Old Kingdom was created and which knew nothing of this mythic history. They knew nothing of the threat hanging over them, the threat that the greed for power would become too widespread for the people of the Old Kingdom to control it, that chaos could return, Uranus rise, overwhelming and destroying life. Now, that's 3 books condensed into 5 minutes, so, okay. Here, if we have eyes for it, is the story of our world, taken, shaken, recoloured and returned to us. And if we're willing, I think this sort of thing is a gift. For far too long, we have attempted to destroy any life and colour in our own creation stories by debating them and directing questions at them that they were never designed to answer. Wordsworth warned us long ago of the danger when we murder to dissect. But we've done so very effectively with both the first few chapters of Genesis and the stunningly beautiful poetry at the end of Job. I think we do better to honour them as the profound stories they are. And this fantasy world of Garth Nix's may help. Now, I'm going to get rid of the visuals here because I don't think your imagination needs them. So, imagine for a moment then our own creation stories illuminated by this one. When God began to create, all was wild, untamed, lifeless chaos. So God began to push that chaos back into form and order to create space for controlled magic of life to exist. Formless darkness was bound by light and entered a pattern of day and night. Swirling waters were separated, with the waters above being held in place by the rakia and the waters below being pushed back by the land. In this unique space and time, set apart from the ongoing chaos beyond, life could begin. Each creature could be created according to its type and place in the ordered, connected pattern, including humanity. And that whole interlocking pattern was held together by God in a charter or a covenant between the divine being and their creation. But then imagine if humanity alone was given the choice in its place, in its pattern. Imagine if humans could choose whether or not they were going to stay connected to that network. And then imagine if certain humans became tempted by the lure of power just beyond their limits, by the vague and alluring promises of more, by the fear of missing out. Were they to break the limit, it would be as if a crack formed, in the Charter keeping chaos at bay, and some of that destructive power would seep into the world, turning the ground infertile, making even the birth of new life painful. What had previously been the joy of caring for a garden now became the slog of battling the diseases and difficulties that had been unleashed on the world. Does that sound familiar? Both from the first 3 chapters of Genesis and from our experience today. There is nothing individual or abstractedly religious about wrongdoing in the theology of Garth Nix or the theology of our world. Nothing individual or abstract about indulging our desires for power, for more. The consequences are utterly material, utterly real, and impact on the whole creation. Now, Nix paints us a world where atrocities are clear, grotesque undead beings rising and bloody murders, and the consequences are dire and immediate. But it is our own world that he's taken and shaken and recoloured and returned to us. Well, think of the characters of the Old Kingdom. They're the baptised, those charged to maintain the Charter, to keep the connections strong between humanity and all that held creation together. In our world, they're also people of the Charter, though we tend to use the word covenant. Abraham and his descendants understood that their obedience to the covenant that the Lord gave them was to bring blessing to the material world as well as the people of the world. And for those of us who count ourselves as Christians, as people of the new Charter, the new covenant, that's our role now too. We're the ones bearing the Charter mark on our foreheads. We're the ones who are aware of the deep fragility of the network of connections holding chaos at bay. And we're the ones who should see at least part of our life's purpose being to heal and restore them. Okay, that's enough there. Let's change gear and move to a world, a fantasy world, which is more familiar to many of you, I should think. It's a world in which there was once a young wizard called Tom Riddle. He was a wizard of exceptional powers and deep resentments, who quickly developed the conviction that he was capable of defeating anyone and anything. With the possible exception of a wizard called Dumbledore, nothing threatened this belief except death. Death couldn't be defeated with a single spell or blackmailed into submission. Therefore, becoming master of death was a deep and complex challenge, which soon became Tom Riddle's obsession. When he renamed himself, he chose the name Voldemort, with its French overtones of fleeing death. When he gathered like-minded followers around him, he called them Death Eaters. And when he found a way of harnessing the death of others to preserve his own life, he seized it. Murder in the world of Harry Potter and Voldemort is an act of such violence that it splits the soul of the one who commits it. Now, rather than be horrified by that, Voldemort manipulated that outcome by murdering a series of people and storing the split portions of his soul in various objects, which are called Horcruxes. Now, as long as any part of his soul survived, Voldemort was tied to life. So no matter how many killing spells were directed at him, the scattered parts of his soul would render them powerless to kill him. Now, I should probably do a warning here. If you're planning on reading the Harry Potter series and haven't, you might want to leave now, because I'm about to give you some major spoilers. Into Voldemort's life come 3 indomitable young school students, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and they make it their quest to find and destroy every Horcrux Voldemort created, and thus remove Voldemort's self-created immortality. What the 3 don't discover until towards the end of the last book is that Harry, the hero of the whole series, is also one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. Neither Harry nor Voldemort even knew it. But when Harry was a baby and Voldemort killed his mother, his unstable soul split again and part of it embedded itself in Harry. The result is that Voldemort can't be killed while Harry is alive. So as the final chapters unfold and the student school Hogwarts prepares itself for battle, Harry learns that he has to put his wand away and give himself up to Voldemort to be killed if the world is to be freed of Voldemort's evil presence. So perhaps one of the most moving chapters in the series. I don't think I would have been alone to howl my eyes out through the chapter. Harry quietly takes the lonely walk to the forest, where he offers no resistance to the waiting Voldemort, and Voldemort kills him. Or he tries to. The next scenes are deliberately surreal. Harry finds himself in an in-between space, which reminds him of a railway station, specifically King's Cross railway station, which Dumbledore finds amusing. And he meets with Dumbledore there, who had died in the previous book. And he learns that he, Harry, could choose to go on deeper into the mystery of what happens after you die, or go back to the ongoing battle at Hogwarts. And he also learns that the reason he has this choice is because of another mistake Voldemort had made when, as he repeatedly did, he underestimated the power of love and life. So way back in the Goblet of Fire book, book 4, Voldemort had staged a dark inversion of resurrection in a graveyard, where the hideous thing, which was all that was left of him at the time, was reclothed in a body built from flesh and blood from another. Now, in his pride and vanity, Voldemort had decided he couldn't use just anyone's blood to rebuild himself. He had to use Harry Potter's blood, because Harry was the one who a prophecy had said could be his only possible undoing. What he didn't consider was that by using Harry's blood, he was taking Harry's life into himself, because blood in this magical world is life. And with Harry's life flowing in Voldemort's veins, Harry is tied to life for as long as Voldemort is alive. So things become very complex. We have this catch-22 situation. Voldemort can't die while Harry lives, because part of Voldemort's soul is in Harry. Harry can't die while Voldemort lives, because Harry's life flows in Voldemort's veins. But there's a resolution to all this that neither Harry or Voldemort dreamed of. When Voldemort hurls a killing curse at Harry in the forest, it does kill something. It kills the fragment of his own soul that is lodged in Harry. All he's able to kill is his own darkness, his own evil, leaving Harry free from all the taints, the taint that he had been carrying since infancy. Now, it's not the end of Voldemort. He holds on to life on the strength of the one bit of soul left in him, but he's been disarmed. He no longer has power over those Harry was willing to die for. And in the end, he does die. The one who would be master of death succumbs to it. Now, while Harry is far from being an allegorical representation of Christ, the whole series is drenched with Christian imagery, and these final scenes particularly so. Here, some seriously obscure threads of belief that underlie our understanding of Christ's atonement are given local habitation and a name. One I would have loved to explore in depth had we had time was the idea of blood being life. We have to have that clearly in our heads if we're ever to understand the sacrificial system of the Old Testament or sacrificial atonement of the New. Because neither of those has anything to do with killing things in order to satisfy an angry God. Both are about bringing life into the deathly contamination of sin and illness to conquer it. So, if you've read the Narnia books, you might remember the end of the Silver Chair, where Caspian, who had died in our world, appears before Aslan and Eustace in Aslan's country, lying in a river. Aslan instructs Eustace to drive a thorn into Aslan's paw, and then he lets his blood drop into the river above Caspian. Do you remember this scene? And Caspian gets younger and younger and eventually leaps out of the river alive. Because life conquers death. And that's what the lifeblood of Jesus did on a big scale. There's a lot more we can unpack there, but I want instead for you to go back in your mind to that scene in the forest with Voldemort and Harry and hold it there while we consider a much earlier fantasy story, Adam and Eve. Remember the rather odd part of that story in the Garden of Eden, where God warns them that if they will eat the forbidden fruit, they will die. Now, the reason it's an odd thing for God to say is, of course, they don't. They both live to ripe old ages. So what God presumably meant then was that by eating the fruit, they made it inevitable that they would die. That by eating the fruit, they allowed death to enter them. Death embedded itself in humanity from humanity's infancy, as surely as Voldemort's dark soul was embedded in the infant Harry. There is within each human being the seed of the corruption of death. Now we can imagine that when Christ took on human nature in its completeness, he also took on the seed of death that was within it. And the figure of evil in that story, Satan, thought to exploit that vulnerability to seize the bizarre, unthinkable opportunity to use death as a tool to destroy God. But just at the point where he was gloating at his victory, when he'd hurled the death curse at Jesus, Satan, like Voldemort, discovered that all he had the power to kill was that taint of death itself. By aiming a killing curse at Harry, Voldemort destroyed the piece of darkness and death that was the sliver of his soul embedded in Harry. By aiming a killing curse at Christ, Satan killed and purged death from his human nature. And in the resurrection, life rose again, uncorrupted, incorruptible, and we were given the mind-blowing promise that the same is offered to us. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you take these stories literally. What I am suggesting is that these stories, these magical images, are just one tool, one way that can help us to rediscover the mystery within the Christian stories. Stories which for far too long, I believe, have been dissected and the resulting spread of lifeless limbs and organs argued over. Let's put our stories and images and oddities back together and let them live, however awkward and strange they might be. Let's learn to be comfortable with the questions they raise, with the fantastic images we're given within our scriptures, which we may find are far more effective in giving local habitation and a name to the things unknown of God than dissection is. So let's use any tools we're given to free our minds from the enchantment of worldliness. Let's enjoy the what-ifs that fantasy writers and our own scriptures throw our way, and in doing so, help ourselves to rediscover the beauty and the mystery of the story of God.